Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to our third day of programming for our second annual Summer Literary Festival. I want to get right into it. I'm so excited. I've been looking forward to this for months. Before we introduce our special guest, I want to thank and introduce my co-panelist and pal, Andy Gyurisin. Andy is in large, if not entirely responsible for helping establish or reestablish his connection with Stephen, because he visited us a couple of years ago in 2018 and went to the Alamo Drafthouse Cinema. And when we were talking about bringing some special guests in this year, Andy recommended Stephen, and I heartily agreed, and we're very fortunate that he accepted our invitation. So let me introduce Andy, my partner in crime. Born in the hills of Pennsylvania with a loud voice and a talent for sitting, Andy Gyurisin has taken his dreams into a career by handling programming and promotions at the Winchester Alamo Drafthouse Cinema here in Winchester, Virginia, as well as being the founder of its film club, which started in his living room and actually became a model for the Drafthouse film clubs all over the nation. Occasionally, the same voice and slightly goofy delivery, these are his words, will be found in May as the official announcer of the Shenandoah Apple Blossom Festival's Firefighter Parade. He's advised small business owners of Lord Fairfax Community College, recommended novels to book lovers as one-time owner of the Winchester Book Gallery, and recently had a beer with Emilio Estevez. If the Alamo Winchester is showing a movie you've never heard of, it's likely because of him. Andy, thank you for being you. Thank you for being here.
That was, I forgot about that introduction that I wrote. I think it still is valid today, so I'm honored by that. That was fantastic. I'm going to keep this introduction train going strong. I've been given the task to introduce our key speaker today, which I'm absolutely honored to do. And so let me begin, because this is quite a lengthy introduction, I should say. So. When asked to introduce one of the most famous faces of stage and screen, I thought there are two paths I could follow. First, the classic Wikipedia read, which I simply cut and paste into the next several lines into this Word document, hoping to fulfill the requirement Sean had asked. That would read something like this. Stephen Harold Tobolowsky, born May 30th, 1951, is, quote, an American actor. Tobolowsky has appeared in over 200 films, plus many television projects, known for his film roles as the insurance agent Ned Ryerson in Groundhog Day, Sammy Jenkis in Memento, as well as television appearances in Deadwood, Glee, Silicon Valley, One Day at a Time. Tobolowsky has worked in the theater, directing and acting plays in New York, San Francisco, and LA. He's directed one movie, Two Idiots in Hollywood, based on the play by the same name, his play. Co-wrote the film True Stories with David Byrne and Beth Henley. Nominated for a Tony Award for Best Performance in 2002. In 2009, Tobolowsky started a new podcast on Slash Film called The Tobolowky Files, which he tells stories. His show was picked up by Public Radio International in 2012. He is the author of 3 books. Whew. Thank you, Wikipedia. But Stephen Tobolowsky is more than just an entry on a website, which is why I'm going to highlight the second path to a great introduction, aptly entitled, How I Met a Man Called Tobo, a 16-page essay. I'm kidding. But what I do know about Stephen is, from the time spent in the Shenandoah Valley, is that he is a champion of independent cinema and champion of independent filmmakers and an educator of his craft. He is an avid storyteller, as you will soon discover, but also a patient listener. He absorbs moments and inspires creativity. He makes impacts on people's lives through laughter, memories that feel familiar, and emotion. His last visit to our community in the Alamo Drafthouse still resonates today with guests, mentioning to me that meeting him was an unforgettable moment to them, a true bookmarked page in their lives. While those films I mentioned earlier are quintessential Tobolowsky, I will always remember him from Guys and Girls Can't Be Friends, a movie filmed here in Winchester and Frederick County by Ben Solenberger and James Camry. I also know him from Stephen Tobolowsky's Birthday Party, a film I discovered via a dark alleyway and someone saying, "Psst, you like movies?" And then last but not least, what I think is one of the greatest, The Primary Instinct, David Chen's film that highlights Tobolowsky's storytelling skills. You may have joined today because you recognize Stephen's face from the screen, but you will leave today impressed by his craft. Ladies and gentlemen, one of my heroes and a man who is often mistaken for someone who works at Starbucks, Stephen Tobolowsky.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I on now? I'm still pondering that Wikipedia entry.
Yeah.
The validity, because sometimes you can't believe all the stuff that's in the Wikipedia. I think there's one thing in there, Romeo Must Die, something like that. It's a film with Jet Li that they insist that I'm in as one of maybe the 200 films I'm in. And I wrote IMDb and Wikipedia and saying, I have no memory of meeting Jet Li or being in this movie. Could you please remove the citation from my resume? And they said no, because we believe you are in this film. And I've never had the patience to sit through Romeo is Bleeding or Romeo Must Die, one of the two. I never have had the patience to sit through it. So in the pandemic, I have vowed to friends of mine, I will sit down and watch this film and see if in fact I am in it.
Let's see if we can break the conspiracy theory, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right.
The urban legend, one of those unsolved mysteries on Netflix right now, is the true Tobolowsky findings and that sort of thing. I wonder if there's other films like that people claim you're in. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think there probably are.
Well, that's a sign of a ubiquitous and successful actor if there's even the slightest chance he doesn't remember what films he's been in.
That is true.
That would let us all aspire to be so productive and cool. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. We're very grateful that you accepted our invitation. And I just want to make clear right from the outset, while we are, of course, delighted and clearly fans of your work spanning film and written, I also want to make clear to anyone watching that this is a very deliberate choice because the festival's theme is the art of storytelling. And I literally couldn't think of anyone more appropriate than you because you can attack this from all these different angles, not least of which as a prolific writer and podcaster. And I especially appreciate, and also I'm glad that Andy specifically mentioned The Primary Instinct, because you start that out by diving into this core question of why do we tell stories? And I think that would be a wonderful place to start and kind of get your take on how that's evolved and how you define it and why it's important.
Yeah, I'm writing a new story now called The Brief History of Disappointment. And what I've come in contact with this year is that everybody takes a look at the obstacles in their life and the disappointments in their lives or things that have held them back. But then I realized I had what we called in humanities class in college, a satori, the curtain parting. And I realized it was the disappointments, it was the hardships in my life that opened the door to various things. For example, in terms of storytelling, I began the podcast with David Chen when I had a broken neck. I had broken my neck in Iceland riding on a horse on the side of an active volcano. What could have gone wrong there? And David called me. He was a student then at Harvard, and he called me at home. And I had nothing to do. I had difficulty dressing myself. I had difficulty eating on my own. So why not begin to put down some of the stories of my life for my kids as kind of a legacy? And I think a real legacy is that my children never have listened to my stories. That is the truth of it. They never read the book, even though it's dedicated. The book is dedicated to my boys. They never looked at it. That's so sad. But I think if I were to look back at the way I view storytelling or the way it's evolved in my head, I think the clearest way is, science, that we always thought of the world as length, width, and depth, that we have 3 dimensions, and that we consider time the 4th dimension thanks to science fiction films. But the 5th dimension is the dimension of narrative, is what I consider. And it is really the way we view the world, more than length, width, and depth, and time. It is the way we see the story we're telling. And quite often, in the story we're telling, it begins with disappointment and hardship. And that's why I think storytellers, it's good to go to the places where you were stopped, where you were caught, where you felt you had nowhere to go, as a nice place to begin to look for the stories you want to tell.
Yeah, I think what I love, and Andy, you jump in here, please. But you really embrace the idea that it's at once this desire to connect, which is just this primordial human that goes back to the earliest days, but is often not necessarily coming from celebration so much as everyone else is suffering or struggling, and that's where we really find these deep bonds that make storytelling, I guess, memorable.
Yeah, and you have to understand, I think that we are more than the sum of our parts. This is something I'm pretty sure of. And I found out that through people doing the Ancestry.com, that I had an ancestor that never made it to America in Russia, that the only thing they knew about him was that he was the storyteller of their town. Now, I see the picture of the guy with an ancient camera, with this huge beard and this black hat and this black coat. I'm going like, well, yeah. Now, why he felt compelled to tell the stories of the people in town could be the same reason I feel compelled to tell the stories of what happened to me. In my case, with the horse and the broken neck, it was a miracle that I was alive. I had a fatal injury. That's what the doctor told me, and I'm here, and I'm alive. So that's a miracle. So I know that miracles exist, which tells us that we're not all made of cause and effect. And that's why narrative is so important, to see what kind of story we're telling. I don't know if this is part of the answer to your question too. I was doing School, that spinoff of the Goldbergs that got canceled this year with the pandemic. It was a funny show. I was on the set, and this fellow Justin, it was his first TV role. He was 17 years old. He was on the set with his father. His father was very excited because I was Ned Ryerson, and he wanted it. And the kid had no idea who Ned Ryerson was. He'd never seen Groundhog's Day. But the father said, "Can you give Justin some advice on how to start a career being an actor?" And my standard advice was always the advice people gave me: don't be disappointed, don't take disappointment to heart. Get a job, get an agent, get a good job, get a good agent. That was the mantra I was taught when I came to Hollywood. And with the emphasis being that getting a job always came before getting an agent. People always think it's the other way around, but agents like actors who get their own jobs. And that was the mantra. Mantra? One of them is an eel. Anyway. Anyway, I was just about to open my mouth and give him that when I had a memory of something that made everything I had thought up until that point not true. A point of narrative. I had forgotten in my life story how I got my first television job in a TV comedy. And I was sitting at home, and I got a call from Mindy Marin, who was a casting director. And it was for the TV show Alice, back with Linda Lavin, Vic Tybeck. A great show, Beth Howland. And Mindy said, we lost our, there's this guy, it's like Wolfman Jack, like Caveman Carl, an FM rock and roll DJ. Can you come in? We lost our Caveman Carl, can you come in and we shoot today? Today is the day we shoot. Come in, meet the director, read through the scene with Beth Howland. If the director says yes, you'll go right into hair and makeup, and then we'll shoot it in front of a live audience. Now, this is back when I could still remember my name. So I go, well, this is great. And I went in and read for them, and that was my first job on network television, which was Caveman Carl. The thing that dawned on me was Mindy Marin did not call me in to audition for Caveman Carl when they were originally doing the show. You know, she didn't call me in for the audition. I had had about 6 auditions with Mindy when I came out to Los Angeles, here, there, and everywhere. I never got a call back. I never even got a pat on the back, attaboy. And I thought every one of those auditions was a failure. You know, you audition, it goes into the black hole of nothing, and you're going nowhere with your life, and your dream is never going to come true. And as an actor, you're ready to slit your wrists. Nothing, nothing, nothing. But when Mindy's back was against the wall, I had apparently made enough impression on Mindy with my failure that in the pinch, she called me in to do this role. And so I tried to tell Justin, the young fellow on the set, I said, Justin, the one thing that hurts you in this business is disappointment. It disheartens you. It weakens your creative spirit. It makes you just want to do nothing, pretend you're in a pandemic and do Zoom theater the rest of your life. Listen, I got my first job from my failures, not because of anything I did as a success. My failures moved me ahead. So you must, who was it? Was it, I want to say, was it Eugene O'Neill? I want to have the strength to move on to greater failures. And that is important in any creative venture, whether you are writing, whether you are acting or directing. Have the energy, the courage to move on to greater failures, because you make more impression and you develop your craft through your failures, your disappointments, than your successes.
Stephen, you know, what a question I have for you then is, what would, in your own personal experience, failure be in storytelling? Like, often with acting role, you don't get a call back, you don't necessarily get the role, you see those failures, yet something could happen there. What do you see as a failure in storytelling that you could then use to grow your craft? Is it the telling of the story over and over again to fine tune it? Or is it resurfacing and trying to figure out why that story doesn't work?
That's a fantastic question. For me, in terms of what I do, I found that what I do is tell true stories. And I try to tell true stories without embellishment. And I try to make the stories as true as possible. Now, in the old days, when I was a kid telling stories, I'd make stuff up. I would just lie. Then in my 20s and 30s, when I'd have a few beers in the kitchen, talking to my friends, telling stories, I would embellish. I have found since I had my broken neck that it's best to always tell the truth in a story, because when you tell a true story, you have a chance for the story to grow, and you have in life a callback to that story where if you fudge, it will bring a lie to an even greater story that happens in the future. That being said, as a premise, the failures I have had in storytelling me is when I missed the picture of what was really truthfully happening. There are many layers of truth. And I remember Stanislavski this is for young actors out there or older actors out there, Stanislavski had 4 levels of observation that when you're on stage, what actors should be aware of. The first level is what you observe. Like, I'm seeing Andy with the glasses on and the beard, and then the Alamo sign behind him. So, and Sean with the beard also, and neither of them have soup in their beard at this time. So it's what I observe. That's just The next level of observation, the more profound level, Stanislavski would say, is behavior. Like I could see Sean tilting his head to the side, going like, oh, behavior, that's interesting. And I could see Andy nodding and wondering who's coming up next. And so it's behavior. The third level of observation is when you truthfully observe someone's emotional state. Like Andy is, I could tell he's interested, he's seeing how that applies to his life, and Sean is amused. He's smiling at this and going, that's true, I do that all the time. And the fourth and most profound level, Stanislavski would say, is revealing your emotional state in return. So Stanislavski said the easiest truths to observe are the first two. What you observe, just what you observe, and behavior. The more profound truths, seeing someone's emotional state and relaying your emotional state, he said gold is always on level 3 and 4. Gold is on levels 3 and 4, but they're harder to get to. In my storytelling, where I found I have failed is when I missed levels 3 and 4. And it's easy to describe level 1. And a lot of times, if we're in a situation of panic or fear or catastrophe, it's easiest simply to relate levels 1 and 2 as well. And then I go back and I think, wait a minute, that isn't what was really happening. I didn't even see this. And then in my mind, I go like, that is what was really happening. So now in my storytelling, I have the confidence of knowing, wait for level 3 and 4. Wait, before you tell that story, before you write that story, really think it through and see what your levels 3 and 4 are, because that's probably where gold is going to be in that story.
So that's amazing and profound. But I have to think that wisdom kind of is the accumulation of experience and a tremendous empathy and curiosity. But I also have to imagine, as a very envious writer that doesn't understand anything about acting really, I have to think, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about how taking someone else's words and trying to find that humanity and that expression and putting it on stage so that it's true and feels true is at the same time you're reading your own words in your one-man shows. And then of course, when you're writing, it's one person in the page, but I have to think that's what makes you so relatable in addition to your talents. But I wonder how much of that's been cultivated over time.
There are like 3 or 4 kind of hidden questions in there. I think it's been cultivated over time, and I would think probably my real talent is, at least from my point of view, is I have been unafraid to make an absolute fool of myself in situations. A lot of times, courage. Again, I never thought I would talk about Stanislavski and a storytelling thing, but Stanislavski said the number one talent an actor has to have is not the ability to laugh and cry on cue, and not the ability of any kind of acuity. It is will. Will. The will to stand up and do something. I remember this story. I don't know if it pertains to another part of your question. I was doing Thelma and Louise, right? And Ridley Scott had a meeting with us before my first scene. So all the actors in the scene would get together. And Ridley said, so what are you going to do? And I said, isn't that what you're supposed to tell me? I mean, you're the director. And he said, well, I always think actors know more about who they are and what they're doing than the director or the writer even.
Wow.
And I want actors who will come in and be the character to tell me what they need to do. So I had absolutely no idea what to do. And I was head of the FBI trying to track these Thelma and Louise down. So I said to Ridley, well, I think what I would do is, and I came up with that old cliche, I would take over the room. I would take over the room. I would come into Thelma's house and I would take over the room. And Ridley kind of looked into space and go, all right, that's fine. All right, fine. And he says, why don't we rehearse one? Why don't we rehearse one and see what that looks like? And so I come in the door, and I didn't know what taking over the room was. So I started doing things that I'd seen on Law and Order. And so I said, Taylor, I want you to put a wiretap on line 2. Johnson, I want you to check the internet for any, do this. And Ridley kind of came up and went like, all right. Well, why don't we shoot one of those and see how that works? And I'm standing outside the door. They closed the door. And I'm thinking, God, that was terrible. I mean, that was cliche. That was awful. What do you do when you take over a meeting as a director? What do you do? And I'm thinking outside, and I'm hearing the first AD inside the room saying, cameras ready? Are all the actors ready? I'm going, but what am I going to do? And I go, snacks. That's what I do. That's what I do when I have meetings. I'm in charge of snacks. I try to give people food to eat. That's what I do. So then it goes, camera ready and action. And I walked in the room and I go, all right, I'm going on a deli run. And I pull out a pad of paper and a pen. Okay, I'm going to have the turkey on rye usually and the coleslaw. What do you want, Johnson? And the guy who was doing the wiretapping looked at me, blueberry muffin? Right, and would you like that heated or with butter? Heated, yeah, okay, heated with butter. And what do you want? What do you want, Briggs? What do you what do you want? Cappuccino? I said, well, that's good. I'm having cappuccino. And you want that like somewhat dry cappuccino? Okay, great. Okay, got that. And I took all the orders and I took the family that was living in there. I took their orders. I says, okay, I'll be back. And I walked out the door and Ridley goes, cut, print. That's what we want. That's it. And it was in my strength there was the courage to be an absolute fool and to tell what I thought was the truth, a more profound truth rather than the Law and Order truth that I did in the rehearsal. So I think in terms of dealing with other people's work as an actor, I try to see what the real truth is of why I'm doing things, and if it leads me down stupid paths, is to have the courage to walk down those paths. And the same thing with writing is to find the truth of the beginning of a story I want to tell. And if I find that truth, it usually is like a string, and it'll lead me to remarkable places that I never could have imagined.
So, Stephen, I want to ask in parallel to this Thelma and Louise story is a question centered around audience or your feedback from audiences. So obviously in Thelma and Louise, in that story you just told, Ridley Scott's positive reaction allowed you to grow and develop that character even further throughout the rest of that film. How often are you listening to the feedback or reaction, so to speak, of people that you're telling stories to, and then taking that feedback and saying, I need to change it, not necessarily away from who you are, but just tweaking it or growing further with it? Is that something that you're always doing with even older and newer stories?
I think that I think there is in this way. I found this true with my writing and my storytelling, and I hear it in other people's storytelling too. So I am suspecting it is a common error, if you want to call it an error. And that is process. That a lot of times in a story, you'll hear a storyteller, there will be a lot of process in the story, where the storyteller's actually working things out. Now see, there was process. I mentioned process and then I describe process. So there's a repetition, and repeated beats are difficult on an audience when they hear a storyteller repeating several beats over and over again. And then I just did it again. See, I repeated a beat. So what I do is, in front of an audience, I will feel where the audience wants to be pulled in, and I see where they're waiting. And I can feel that, and a lot of times I'll go back and cut. And I'll cut things out, especially at the beginning. I have found in stories, when you're storytelling, and you are alone on stage, and in terms of primary instinct, you're going to be alone on stage for 2 hours. Now, the movie is only a little over an hour. I think it's like 72 minutes or something, because that's just the first half of the show. Because the whole storytelling concert was 2 hours. You're alone on stage 2 hours. When you are in a play, a regular play, the audience will give you 3, 4, even 5 minutes before they go like, get me out of here. When you're doing storytelling and you're alone on stage, the audience gives you 8 to 12 seconds. You know, like, okay, do we need to get out of here? Because it's only going to be this person talking for a certain length of time. And so I have found when you tell a story on stage, when you're performing a story, you have to begin it like a Beatles song. I think one of the geniuses of the Beatles lyrics is there anyone that's going to listen to my story? You think you lost your love? I saw her yesterday. It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. She says she loves you. And you know that, I mean, they begin the song like, wow, holy, I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. And you're there. There's nothing, no fat at the beginning. And so a lot of times I find I need to cut at the beginning and move quicker into the story. And once the audience sees where you're going with it, they get ahead of the narrative very quickly. And so cutting is one thing I'll do. If I have an unfavorable venture live on stage telling a story, I'll go back and I'll think, where did I lose them? When do I need to move ahead? Now, I don't know if it's skipping ahead to another question, but one way you move ahead is what I call reinventing Act One. And it's always great to reinvent Act One. TV shows do this all the time. In the second season, they bring in another character. Oh my gosh. And suddenly it's like, whoa, we're seeing something new. By interviewing a new topic, a new subject, a new angle on the story, you are reinventing Act One. And the problem for storytellers too is if you do that too often, it's like hitting people over the head with a 2x4. You can't do it that often, but you have to find the places you need to reinvent Act One in the story by bringing in new information.
Yeah. So it's so fascinating, Stephen, because, you know, throughout this festival, and I typically am talking more to writers, but I don't think it's a stretch, and anyone that has any experience in any of the fields understands that there's tremendous overlap when it comes to composition and execution. But I want to linger a little bit and draw out, because I am struck, you know, of course, like any red-blooded American, I've seen all your movies. But I wasn't as familiar with the writing and the stand-up, but the one-man shows, but the notion of truth. And I think it reminded me of Tim O'Brien, who wrote The Things They Carried. And in one of the stories, he does the unthinkable and breaks the third screen as an author and says, I'm trying to tell you something more true than truth. And even that, he kind of complicates. He's like, I could tell you the truth, and I'm not going to stretch the truth, but I want to get at something elemental. And that's what really stuck with me about, you know, the primal instinct is this notion of you're telling stories, but you've put the time in to really get at the real meat of what this means.
It's I think I could bring this up. Tell me if this is too much in the weeds. There's certain thinkers and writers that influence me a lot. And one of them has been Aristotle. And I think Aristotle, besides coming up with the 3-act structure, because if you take a look at narratives before Aristotle, it follows very much the pattern of the book of Exodus, which is you got this plague, and then 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 you got, that is what structure was pre-Aristotle. And not only in Europe and Asia Minor in that place, but if you look at pre-Columbian writings from Central and South America, it's the same thing, a list of things that happen. Aristotle is the guy who put it together and said, you have an introduction, you have rising action, you have a conclusion, that's Act 3, and a story really works if you connect Act 3 with Act 1. Then the audience feels that they have seen the truth beyond the truth. Aristotle came up with an idea that one of my first screenplays I wrote, I got a meeting with the head at that time of United Artists, one of the big heads of United Artists, my first screenplay, and I had no idea how to do a pitch meeting, no idea at all. And so I'm going in with my friend cinematographer, Robert Brinkman, who got me the meeting with Jeff Kleeman and said, Stephen, you wrote this story, just tell him the story of your movie. I said, all right, I'll tell him the story of the movie. So we went into Jeff's beautiful office overlooking Warner Brothers, and Jeff's charming, wonderful guy, he says, so Stephen, I hear you've written a movie. Why don't you tell me about it? And I did for the next 1 hour and 40 minutes. I told him every scene, every character, even lines of dialogue at the end. And I missed that Jeff's eyes were like, and I'm doing that. And Jeff at the end goes, well, thank you for that, Stephen. And just a little note, next time someone asks you to tell them about the movie, give them the elevator version of the movie. And I said, I'm sorry, Jeff, I don't know what the elevator version is. He says, that is the version of the movie you could tell on an elevator with someone going from the first to the second floor. First to the second floor. So, Stephen, use images that we're familiar with, like Dirty Harry in space, or the Muppets in the Old West. And we'll get the idea of what your story is. All people want is the essence. And that made such an impression on me. Now, what I have since found out is the concept of essence comes from Aristotle. And it was a translation. Aristotle came up with the idea in his book on things that everything is made up of what is seen and what is hidden. It's a combination of the two, and he called it et tu in enai, something like that. I don't speak ancient Greek, but it's something like that. You could Google it. Aristotle,
you had it.
Et tu in enai. And what it means is the what it was to be. Everything could be defined as the what it was to be. You could Google it. And another important thing about Aristotle, even though he was Greek, when Rome took over Greece, unlike other conquests where you just throw away everything that exists, you burn their temples, you destroy their statues, you get rid of their great thinkers, Rome said, this Aristotle guy, I think we're going to keep him. And so they kept all the teachings of Aristotle and translated them into Latin. And so the Roman Empire went all the way through Europe to England, all the way to Persia. So all of this now is permeated with the ideas of Aristotle, and the Italian translation, the Latin translation of et tu enai the guys didn't know what to do with the phrase, the what it was to be, was essenziato. Essenziato, I don't even speak Latin. But it was the word essence and it came from, that was the closest they could get to talking about what Aristotle wanted to talk about. So the truth, beyond the truth, is when you take a look at your subject matter and you describe what is there. You could describe that truthfully, but you have not found the truth, the essence, until you discover what is hidden. And I am suggesting that's probably what that storyteller was trying to say. He had to discover what is hidden.
I like this. I'm also getting a little bit of feedback on my end. My apologies.
Oh,
it's me.
Yeah, well, don't do that again.
I've tried my best. Stephen, I do want to ask you though, like, how does the outside world influence storytelling as well? In terms of, I think about, 80s and 90s, especially when I think about like movies, I think about escapism. Prior to where we are right now, I always thought the more realistic your story, the stronger, the changing audience, so to speak of. And I think my second part to that question is, where is your storytelling in a COVID world right now? What are you thinking about? What are you processing as you tell your stories as we're going through this really bizarre time right now?
I think the quickest answer to that is, the answer to both of those things is you're talking about a mathematical equation with two unknowns. And the biggest mistake people make is they think that they themselves are a known quantity. And the thing that they are relating to is also a known quantity. We know from the COVID issue that nobody knows what the hell this thing is. But my father, who doesn't remember much of anything now, he's 97 and blind, and he can't walk. He's in a senior living place in Texas, and I cannot visit him because no one is allowed in or out of the place because of COVID. So I called Dad a couple times a week. And he said, in his shattered state of memory, he says, Stephen, this reminds me so much of the polio epidemic in the early 50s. He said, it was so terrifying for me. I was a young doctor, and nobody knew what polio was. And nobody knew where it came from and who carried it. We eventually knew, and Dad didn't share this, but my brother did. Piggybacking on what Dad said, is that 90% of polio was asymptomatic. And of the 10% and so the spread was asymptomatic like COVID. And of the 10% that got it, 9 out of 10, it was just stomach flu, stomach distress, nothing. But the 1% could die. So my father said he was terrified as a young doctor to give polio shots, which they weren't sure that they would work at all at our elementary school. And this is before I went to elementary school, but my brother threw in that how proud he was that my father was giving those shots to all the kids, that Dad was one of the heroes of giving this. And then Dad saying, I was so scared because I didn't know if I would get polio and bring it into our home. So you have different layers of truth in that relationship of the story. My father relating about his life at a different point in time and relating to his fear, and his number one fear was for his family. That was his truth that Dad shared. He never said anything about that he would get polio and die. His fear was that he would get polio and bring it to his family. And that tells you something about my father, a truth beyond a truth about my father. In terms of COVID, it's given me a lot of time to write and clean the rabbit cage. I tell you, my wife and I, we've become like we're on a Mormon commune here. It's like we don't go anywhere. She cooks, she bakes, she bakes bread all day, and then she makes pies and cakes. And I eat a diet of cake and cinnamon rolls and pies, and I've lost 15 pounds. So I may have a diet book in the works, after all this. But COVID has given me a lot of time to go back and think through moments of my life. But at the same time, it's cut out my observation of the world. I'm really not able to go out and observe. And observation of the world you don't do on television. That isn't what happens. You have to go out into the world. So that's how COVID's affected that. Did I answer your question?
You did.
Okay.
Well, it leads me to another just great question. Where are you thinking about storytelling in terms of the future as well? One of the successes that you've had, of course, is your podcasting, which allows you to tell your stories to a much bigger audience and that sort of thing. Where do you see the future of storytelling as we keep moving forward through all of this?
Well, for me, I think as I age, again, this is how we all become caricatures of ourselves. When we're young, all we're driven by is ambition. We think it's love, but it's ambition. And we're going in 50 directions at once with limitless power to see where we're going to land. And then we end up landing. And what I guess was it Jung was talking about individuation? Jung or Freud, one of them, that as we get older, we become more and more what ourselves are. We become less frantic about our lives. We know what we like and we dislike, and we become our own best counsel. And then as we get older beyond that, we become a caricature of ourselves because we only listen to our own counsel. and then we become just a shell of what we were. Again, going back to disappointment, one of the great things about disappointment is that it leads us into paths that we never would have discovered otherwise, enriches. And the problem with satisfaction is that we develop routines to keep everything the same because we sleep so much better when we're satisfied. But the real tragedy of satisfaction is we forget the dissatisfaction that brought us to the point of satisfaction. So I had a great acting teacher, Ed K. Martin, who said, comfort is the enemy of the artist. So the future of storytelling for me is to dare to continue to be uncomfortable, is to continue to put yourself in situations that aren't easy and observe and take a look at other memories in your life. In terms of me, I happen to have one of these kind of trick memories that I remember a lot of detail from my past, is to examine past moments of my life, hopefully past mistakes, to see what I did, past terrors I had, to see how I overcame the terror. And one thing, Andy, in terms of one of your past questions, I have found that when I tell a true story, like, for example, the conference hour story I told on the podcast about how the teacher, Joan Potter, tried to kick me out of college, out of drama school. She did a very good job of it. Is when I did that story on the podcast, and I think it's podcast number 12 or 13, I got emails from all over the world of people saying the same thing happened to me. And then I read their emails and I said, I'm looking the story they're telling me, it's not the same thing at all. None of their stories were the same thing, but they felt the story was the same because it was the story of them against unbelievable odds about a position, someone in a position of authority, be it a parent, a teacher, a priest, something in authority abusing them, and them triumphing over that or getting around it and surviving. So when you tell a true story, everybody hears it and they think it's their story. Whereas if you lie about a story, people can smell it and they go like, no, that isn't really my story. And so it can't continue. So I think the future of storytelling for me is to continue to be investigate areas that are uncomfortable, and to try to tell the truth about them to the best of my ability.
Stephen, I think a question came in that I think was a great way to sort of parallel all of this. When you think back on your career as a storyteller, do you have, and the question was specifically about growing up in Dallas, but who were some of your influences in the world of storytelling?
Oh my gosh, I see here the name of the person who asked this question.
Oh, yeah.
Is Marshall Millsap, which happens to be one of my old high school buddies. Marshall was certainly involved in debate and drama. And I think, Marshall, am I right? You also did a lot of extemporaneous speaking. You and Mark Hodges did a lot of extemporaneous speaking. But Marshall, great speaker, great debater. And
it's a small world,
lying,
Stephen.
Marshall, I'd be lying if I said Mr. Peppermint was a great storyteller. But I think probably one of the people in Dallas that influenced me the most in terms of storytelling was Larry O'Dwyer, a director and actor at Theater 3. He was a big star in Dallas, and he was remarkable. And Larry influenced me in a lot of different ways. I just thought the guy was an absolute genius. And his discussion of how to direct and how to act and what he did on stage really influenced me a ton. So Larry O'Dwyer, Marshall, Larry. And I'll tell you somebody else, Marshall. Mary Curtis, our speech teacher. Mary Curtis. I don't know if she really was a teacher. I really don't know. But what she did is she left us to our own failures and our own whatever. And we learned with her shepherding. She was more of a shepherd than a teacher. We learned the hard way. So hats off to Mary. Really wonderful.
I love that. A virtual event like this has connected some familiar faces back again. I love that right there.
Yeah, Marshall says, and he also did poetry reading. The Machine, yes, The Machine never wastes anybody's time. Right, Marshall? That's the one you did? Oh. Yeah. Oh, Marshall saying, yeah, Mary the Shepherdess. Yes. Oh, gosh.
Look at that. A flush of memories right there. I love
a flush of memories with Mr. Millsap. Oh, what a great guy. What a great person.
Well, are you... Go ahead, Sean.
Just to say that kind of brings us full circle as we get a little bit closer to the end. One of the things that's come up in virtually all the talks we've seen this weekend, and as it relates to COVID, is I think you've clearly articulated, how you're leaning into discomfort and trying to find the art there. But I think it's important both for the artistic community as well as just the audience. Right now, I think the biggest issue is isolation and connecting. And this festival is certainly trying to continue to connect people. How do you feel about the future and how are you going to connect, and what do you encourage others to do to stay connected?
I'm very much looking for, it appears it could be a future where I'll never act again. I have to look at that reality. And I have felt with COVID the absolute essential nature of humans connecting. I remember I did a reading in Portland at Powell's bookstore. And in some of my early stories, I talk about Claire Richards, a girl I fell in love with when I was 8 years old, when I saw her play the piano in her Bluebird outfit. And I'm going like, wow. And she turned out to be one of the great pianists. I mean, she was playing, symphony. I mean, she was a concert quality pianist. I love Claire. So I wrote a couple stories about Claire, and I'm doing a story at Powell's, and I'm doing it and walking into that room on the 4th floor where you do it. I see Claire Richards walk in the room, but not Claire Richards, because it wasn't a 60-year-old Claire Richards. It was Claire Richards as I knew her when she was younger, and I'm walking and I'm trying to do this story, and my mind is looking at her, and I go, I couldn't. At the end of the story, everybody lines up to get a book, and I sign a book, and the woman came up to me, and I said, I am so sorry that during the reading and during my story, I kept staring at you. It's just, you won't believe this, but you remind me of somebody that I used to love. And she goes, I know, I'm her daughter.
Oh, wow.
She said, I'm Claire Richards' daughter. I don't live in Portland. I was flying into Portland to visit friends, and I saw the ad for this on TV, and I came here, and I wanted to tell you that our mother never talked much about her life. And the only thing I really know about Mom's childhood is through your stories. And I want to thank you for that connection.
Wow.
And it's the benefit of doing a true story, but, because then you give that honor to that relationship with Claire. I mean, I think we went on one date. I don't think, we were always missed opportunities, but the desire for human connection, to feel a reflection off of that wall, to feel that power of your personality bouncing off of someone else's is what COVID is taking away from us. And it's what's making people go crazy. It's what makes them want to walk around without a damn mask. To say, screw this. That's what I think is important, is to realize that that is a primary instinct. To tell stories, and to tell stories to people. If you remember the beginning of Beowulf, like a Beatles song, the first line of Beowulf, wait. That's how that story begins. Wait.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where we are now. We want to go outside and say, wait a second. Yeah. And that's what COVID's doing to me.
Well, Stephen, I think we've come to a conclusion here to all of this, which is, we could go for hours. There's no question about that. And I would welcome that at any particular time. But I will ask one further question, just because I think it will help us as we wrap off all of this. Where can people continue to hear your stories today, right now?
Right now, Tobolowkyfiles.com. David Chen has created a nice new website, Tobolowkyfiles.com. We have 83 hours of the stories we've done, and I've just finished another 12 new stories. David and I are going to do another work session today. We finished 7 new stories, and we're going to start dropping those into that website. So Tobolowkyfiles.com, you can listen to all the old stories, and certainly on Twitter at Tobolowsky, and I'm on Facebook, Stephen Tobolowsky, and I will answer your call. And if you have any emails or anything you want to send me, you could post it on Tobolowkyfiles.com, and I'll answer those as well.
Great, because I know we had some questions that we didn't quite get to, which is fine. That happens in a situation like this. And so that's a perfect way for folks to still connect and keep this conversation going long after this is done. So Thank you, Stephen, for this opportunity. Sean, am I missing anything?
No, other than thanks to you both, Stephen. As Andy said, we could and probably should talk for hours. So hopefully we'll see you again. Continue.
Thank you. Is it possible to answer some of the questions, to type the answer to stay on offline, or do I vanish when you go?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I think if you mute and stop video, you can still answer questions in the chat room.
I'll do that.
So let's do that.
I'll answer the questions in the chat room.
Okay.
Right on.
Perfect.
Stephen, thank you so much. Great pleasure and an honor. Thanks for spending time with us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Right.
Thank you, Sean. What a great
Bye-bye.
day.